The blood on her dress had frozen into dark crimson patches by the time she stumbled through the pine trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to white vapor in the bitter December air. Sarah Atwood pressed her hand against the trunk of a towering spruce, fighting the urge to collapse into the snow that had been falling steadily for 3 days across the Colorado Territory, transforming the landscape into a treacherous maze of white that threatened to swallow her whole. Behind her, carried on the howling wind that swept down from the mountains, came the voices of the men who had murdered her father and burned their homestead to the ground. Men who wanted to ensure no witness survived to tell what they had done to an honest rancher who refused to sell his water rights. She had been running for 2 days, surviving on nothing but melted snow and the fierce determination that came from knowing that 10 armed outlaws wanted her dead. Her wool coat, once a deep blue her mother had been so proud of, was torn and stained, offering little protection against the elements that seemed intent on finishing what the murderers had started. Sarah's dark hair, usually pinned up properly, hung in wet tangles around her face, and her fingers had gone numb hours ago inside her threadbare gloves. The winter of 1881 had arrived early in Colorado, catching everyone unprepared, and the storm that had been raging across Weld County showed no signs of letting up. The crack of a branch behind her sent panic shooting through her exhausted body. Sarah pushed away from the tree and forced her legs to move, though every muscle screamed in protest. Her boots sank deep into the fresh powder with each step, making progress agonizingly slow. The voices grew louder, and she could hear them spreading out, searching the forest systematically. They knew she could not have gotten far in these conditions. They had horses, supplies, and numbers on their side. All she had was desperation. Her foot caught on a hidden root, and she went down hard, the impact driving what little air remained from her lungs. Sarah lay there for a moment, face pressed against the frozen ground, wondering if she should simply let the cold take her. At least it would be gentler than what those men would do if they caught her. But then she thought of her father, of how he had fought to give her those precious minutes to escape, and she forced herself back to her feet. The trees began to thin ahead, and through the swirling snow she could make out what looked like a clearing. Perhaps there would be shelter, somewhere to hide, somewhere to gather what remained of her strength. Sarah pushed forward, her vision beginning to blur at the edges, unsure if it was from exhaustion, cold, or the tears that kept freezing on her cheeks. She broke through the tree line and nearly sobbed with relief. A small ranch house sat in the clearing, smoke rising from its chimney like a beacon of hope. Behind it stood a barn, and she could see a corral where several horses huddled together against the storm. But relief quickly turned to fresh terror as she heard the shouts behind her grow triumphant. They had seen her emerge from the trees. They knew they had her cornered. Sarah ran toward the house, her legs barely supporting her weight. She made it perhaps 20 yards before she collapsed again, this time unable to rise. The world tilted sickeningly, and she could only watch as the dark shapes of riders emerged from the forest, spreading out in a line to block any escape. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, she counted them. 10 men, just as there had been when they had ridden onto her father's land 3 days ago with their demands and their weapons. The door to the ranch house opened, and a figure stepped out onto the porch. Sarah tried to call for help, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, stolen by the wind. The figure was tall, dressed in dark wool and leather, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the storm. She watched as he took in the scene before him with the careful assessment of someone who had seen trouble before and knew its shape. The leader of the outlaws, a cruel man named Dutch Morneau who wore a scar across his face like a badge of honor, reined in his horse about 30 feet from where Sarah lay in the snow. The other 9 riders formed a loose semicircle behind him, their hands resting on their weapons. Dutch had worked as a foreman for the railroad company, using intimidation and violence to acquire land for their expansion, and he was very good at his job. "That girl belongs to us," Dutch called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "She witnessed something she should not have, and we aim to make sure she keeps quiet about it. Step aside, stranger, and you can go back to your breakfast. This does not concern you." The man on the porch was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could see him looking at her, taking in her condition, the blood on her dress, the desperation written in every line of her collapsed form. Then he stepped down from the porch, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle and equal years learning when to fight and when to walk away. But his path took him directly to where Sarah lay, placing himself between her and the 10 armed men. "I reckon it concerns me now," the cowboy said, and his voice was steady as stone. "This is my land, and that makes her my responsibility. You want her, you are going to have to go through me." Lucas Thorn had built his ranch 3 years ago, with money saved from a decade of cattle drives and deputy work in towns across the frontier. At 26 years old, he had seen enough violence to last a lifetime, and had hoped that settling in the relative peace of Greeley, Colorado, would mean leaving that life behind. But some things, he believed, were worth fighting for, and watching 10 grown men hunt down an exhausted girl who looked barely old enough to be out of school was not something he could stomach, storm or no storm. Dutch laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are either very brave or very stupid, friend. There are 10 of us and 1 of you. Those are poor odds even for a hero." "Mathematics was never my strong suit," Lucas replied, his hand hanging loose at his side, close to the Colt revolver holstered on his hip. "But I learned a long time ago that numbers do not always tell the whole story. Now, I am going to count to 3, and you are going to turn those horses around and ride back the way you came. If you are still in my sight when I reach 3, we are going to have a problem that will not end well for anyone." Sarah watched this exchange through a haze of disbelief and fading awareness. This stranger was going to die because of her, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. She tried again to speak, to tell him to save himself, but darkness was closing in from all sides, and the cold had finally reached deep enough to steal the last of her strength. "1," Lucas said, his voice carrying clear and calm across the snow. Dutch's hand moved toward his gun, and Sarah saw the other riders tense, ready to draw. This cowboy was about to die for someone he did not even know, and it was all her fault. 2. The shot rang out before Lucas reached 3, but it did not come from Dutch. One of the outlaws, a younger man with more eagerness than sense, had drawn first, and his bullet kicked up snow 3 feet to Lucas's left. What happened next occurred so fast that Sarah, even in her deteriorating state, could barely follow it. Lucas's Colt cleared leather in a blur of motion, and his first shot took the eager young outlaw in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. The horses, already nervous from the storm, panicked at the gunfire, and 2 of them bolted, carrying their riders back toward the trees. Lucas dove sideways, rolling behind a water trough as the remaining outlaws opened fire, their bullets punching through the wooden slats and sending up geysers of frozen water. But Lucas was no longer where they were aiming. He came up on the other side of the trough and fired twice more, each shot placed with the precision of someone who had spent years making every bullet count. One struck Dutch's horse in the flank, sending the animal rearing and throwing its rider into the snow. The other caught an outlaw named Pierce in the leg, and his howl of pain joined the chaos of screaming horses and shouting men. The storm had intensified, the wind driving snow so thick it was nearly impossible to see more than a few feet clearly. Lucas used this to his advantage, moving low and fast across the clearing toward his barn. Bullets followed him, but the visibility and their panic made the outlaws aim wild. He made it to the barn door and ducked inside, and for a moment the shooting stopped as both sides reassessed. Sarah had managed to drag herself a few feet toward the house, though every movement felt like swimming through deep water. She could hear Dutch shouting orders to his remaining men, telling them to spread out, to surround the barn, to burn it if necessary. They had come too far and done too much to let one cowboy and a witness ruin everything. Glass shattered in an upstairs window of the ranch house, and Sarah looked up to see the barrel of a rifle emerge. Lucas had somehow made it from the barn back into his house without her seeing, using a back entrance or tunnel perhaps. The rifle spoke once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, and 3 more outlaws went down, their wounds non-fatal but effective enough to take them out of the fight. Dutch struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage. He grabbed the reins of a riderless horse and hauled himself into the saddle, his own weapon drawn. Forget the barn, the girl, get the girl. 2 of the remaining outlaws, men hardened by years of violence and bad choices, spurred their horses toward where Sarah lay near the porch. She could see death riding toward her and found she was too tired to feel afraid anymore. At least she had tried. At least her father would know she had not given up. The ranch house door exploded outward, and Lucas came through it like a force of nature. He had ditched his coat and hat, and Sarah could see he was younger than she had first thought, with dark hair and eyes that held a fierce determination. He reached her just as the first rider bore down on them, and he pulled her behind him with one arm while raising his Colt with the other. "I told you," Lucas said, his voice still steady despite having just fought off 8 men. "You will have to go through me." The outlaw's horse, already spooked and exhausted, refused to charge directly at the man standing his ground. It veered to the side, and Lucas's shot took the rider in the arm, sending his weapon spinning away into the snow. The second rider tried to circle around, but Lucas had positioned himself perfectly, using the porch supports as cover while keeping Sarah protected behind him. "Dutch," one of the remaining outlaws shouted, "this is not worth it. We need to go." Dutch Morneau sat on his stolen horse, breathing hard, his men scattered and wounded around him. He looked at Lucas, at the girl huddled behind him, and the mathematics he had mocked earlier suddenly seemed much less favorable. 4 of his men were seriously wounded, 3 more had fled on panicked horses, and 2 remained with him, looking more interested in survival than revenge. "This is not over," Dutch snarled. "The railroad wants that land and they will get it. The girl saw what happened to her father and she will pay for that knowledge." "The railroad can take their wants to hell," Lucas replied. "And if you or anyone else comes back here looking for her, you will find me waiting. I promise you, Dutch Morneau, that is not an experience you will enjoy. I recognized you the moment you opened your mouth. I worked with your brother down in New Mexico territory 5 years back, before you murdered him for his share of a silver claim. You have been running from justice ever since, hiding behind the railroad's money and influence. But that protection will not save you if you touch this girl." Dutch's face went white, then red with fury. "You do not know what you are talking about." "I know exactly what I am talking about. I also know that the U.S. Marshal in Denver has been looking for you for 3 years. 1 telegram is all it would take to bring him and a dozen deputies down here. So you need to ask yourself if 1 witness is worth spending the rest of your life in prison or at the end of a rope." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the moans of wounded men. Dutch stared at Lucas for a long moment, and Sarah could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, weighing revenge against survival, pride against pragmatism. "Mount up," Dutch finally said to his remaining men. "We are leaving." "But the girl," one of them started. "I said we are leaving." Dutch wheeled his horse around, then looked back at Lucas one last time. "You just made a powerful enemy, Cowboy. The railroad does not forget, and neither do I." "I will try to sleep at night despite my terror," Lucas said dryly. Sarah watched through blurred vision as the outlaws gathered their wounded and rode back into the forest, their threats and bravado dissolving into the storm like smoke. Only when they had completely disappeared did Lucas turn to her, and his expression softened from the hard mask of a fighter to something gentler, more concerned. "Easy now," he said, kneeling beside her in the snow. "You are safe. They are gone." "You should not have," Sarah tried to say, but her words slurred together, and the darkness she had been fighting finally claimed her. Lucas caught her before she fell, surprised by how light she was, how cold her skin felt even through her frozen clothing. He lifted her carefully and carried her into his house, kicking the door shut behind him against the storm. The fire in his hearth was burning low, and he quickly added more wood before laying her on his sofa, the only piece of furniture in the main room besides a table and 2 chairs. He had built this house for himself alone, never expecting to need space for anyone else, and now he found himself wishing he had made it larger, warmer, more welcoming. Lucas worked quickly, removing her frozen boots and coat, checking for wounds beneath the blood on her dress. Most of it appeared to be from someone else, though she had cuts and bruises that would need tending. What concerned him most was her temperature. She was dangerously cold, and he knew from experience on the trail that cold could kill just as surely as any bullet. Lucas grabbed every blanket he owned and piled them over her, then heated water on his stove for tea and broth. While the water warmed, he checked his weapons, reloading and cleaning them by habit, his ears tuned for any sound that might indicate the outlaw's return. But there was nothing except the storm, which showed no signs of abating. He found himself looking at the girl on his sofa, really seeing her for the first time now that the immediate danger had passed. She was young, probably around 20 or 21, with a face that would have been pretty if it was not currently gray with cold and exhaustion. Her dark hair was matted with snow and sweat, and even unconscious, she looked haunted by whatever horrors she had endured. Lucas had seen that look before, on the faces of survivors from Indian raids, stagecoach robberies, and range wars. It was the expression of someone who had witnessed death and violence and would carry those memories forever. He felt a surge of anger at Dutch and his men, at the railroad company that employed them, at a system that valued land and money more than human decency. The water boiled, and he made weak tea, adding honey from his carefully hoarded supply. When Sarah still had not stirred after 10 minutes, Lucas sat beside her and gently lifted her head, trying to get some of the warm liquid past her lips. She responded instinctively, swallowing a little, though her eyes remained closed. "That is it," he said softly. "Small sips. You are going to be all right. I promise." He stayed there for an hour, periodically offering her tea, checking to make sure her breathing remained steady, adding more wood to the fire until the room felt almost tropical. Color began to return to her face, and her shivering, which had been violent at first, gradually calmed to occasional tremors. Lucas finally allowed himself to relax slightly, though he kept his rifle within easy reach. The storm outside was a mixed blessing. It would make pursuit nearly impossible, but it also meant he could not get Sarah to a doctor in Greeley, which was 8 miles away. She would need to recover here, under his care, and he found himself hoping he remembered enough of his mother's nursing skills to help her through whatever lay ahead. As darkness fell and the storm continued its assault on the Colorado plains, Lucas made himself coffee and settled into the chair by the fire, his eyes moving between the windows and the girl on his sofa. He had woken up that morning expecting just another day of feeding livestock and repairing fences. Now he was harboring a witness to murder, had made enemies of the railroad and a gang of killers, and was responsible for keeping alive someone he did not even know. But as he watched Sarah sleep, her face gradually relaxing from the tight mask of fear it had worn, Lucas found he did not regret his choice. Some things were worth fighting for, and some lines could not be crossed without someone standing up to say no. If that made him a target, so be it. He had been a target before and survived. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and Lucas Thorn kept his vigil through the long winter night. Sarah woke to warmth and the smell of cooking bacon, two sensations so unexpected that for a moment she thought she must be dead, and this was whatever came after. But the ache in her muscles and the dull throb behind her eyes felt too real to be anything but life, and she opened her eyes to find herself staring at rough-hewn wooden beams and a ceiling that was not her own. Memory returned in a rush that made her gasp and sit up too quickly. The room spun, and she grabbed the edge of the sofa to steady herself, her heart pounding as she remembered the fire, her father's death, the chase through the winter forest, and the cowboy who had stood between her and 10 armed men. "Easy there," a voice said, and she turned to see Lucas standing by the stove, a spatula in one hand and concern on his face. "You have been through hell. No need to rush things now." Sarah stared at him, taking in the details she had missed during the chaos of their first meeting. He was tall and lean, built like someone who made his living through physical labor, but had the careful, economical movements of a man who knew how to conserve his strength. His dark hair needed cutting, and he had not shaved in a few days, giving him a slightly rough appearance that should have been intimidating but somehow was not. His eyes were what caught her attention most, deep brown and steady, holding both wariness and kindness in equal measure. "You saved my life," Sarah said, her voice rough from disuse and cold. Lucas shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the statement. "I did what anyone would do." "No," she said firmly, surprised by the strength in her voice. "Most people would have shut their door and pretended they saw nothing. You stood against 10 armed men for a stranger. That is not what anyone would do. That is what a good man does." He turned back to the stove, but she could see the tips of his ears redden slightly. "You must be hungry. I have bacon, eggs, and biscuits. They are not fancy, but they will put some strength back in you." Sarah realized she was starving, her stomach cramping with need. She could not remember the last time she had eaten, sometime before the outlaws had arrived, before her world had burned to ash and blood. "I do not want to impose. You are not imposing," Lucas said, bringing her a plate piled high with food. "I have plenty, and you need it more than I do right now. Eat." She did, trying to maintain some semblance of manners but failing as hunger took over. The food was simple but perfect, and she could feel strength flowing back into her body with each bite. Lucas ate standing up, his position by the window allowing him to watch the yard and the tree line beyond. "The storm broke about an hour ago," he said. "I checked the perimeter at dawn. No sign of those men, but that does not mean they will not come back once the weather clears." Sarah set down her fork, the food suddenly heavy in her stomach. "You should not be involved in this. What I witnessed, what they did the railroad is powerful, and Dutch Morno is vicious. If they come back with more men or if they send others, let me worry about that," Lucas interrupted gently. "Right now, you need to focus on recovering, then we need to figure out our next move." Our next move, Sarah repeated. You cannot go to the law in Greeley. If the railroad is involved, they likely have the sheriff in their pocket. And you cannot run forever, not in winter, not alone. So we need a plan, and that means working together. Sarah looked at this stranger who had already risked so much for her, and she felt something crack open inside her chest, some combination of gratitude and grief and desperate hope. My name is Sarah Atwood. My father was James Atwood. We had a ranch about 15 miles north of here, near the Cache-la-Powder River. The railroad wanted our land because it has the best water access in the region. My father refused to sell. 3 days ago, Dutch and his men rode in during supper. They shot my father and burned our house. I hid in the root cellar until they left, then I ran. They have been hunting me ever since. Lucas listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. I am Lucas Thorn, he finally said. I came here from Texas 3 years ago, hoping to build something honest and clean, away from the violence that seems to follow me no matter where I go. I should have known it would find me eventually. It always does. I am sorry, Sarah said. I have brought this to your door. No, Lucas said firmly, turning to look at her. Dutch and the railroad brought this. You are just trying to survive. There is no shame in that, and you have nothing to apologize for. Sarah found herself holding his gaze, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt something other than terror and grief. This man, this stranger who had appeared like salvation out of the storm, made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in days. More than that, he made her feel seen, like she was a person worthy of protection rather than just a problem to be solved or eliminated. What do we do now? She asked. Lucas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. We have a few options. I have some money saved, enough to get you on a stage east, back to family if you have any. You could start over somewhere the railroad's reach does not extend. I have an aunt in St. Louis, Sarah said slowly, but that feels like running away, like letting them win. My father died for that land, for the principle that a man should not have to surrender what is rightfully his just because someone with more money and guns wants it. If I run, what does his death mean? It means you survived, Lucas said gently. Sometimes survival is the only victory we get. Is that what you believe? Sarah asked, and she heard the challenge in her own voice. Is that why you stood against those men yesterday? Because you believe survival is enough? Lucas smiled, a quick flash of humor that transformed his serious face into something younger and more open. You are going to be trouble, are you not? I have been told that before, Sarah admitted, feeling an answering smile tug at her own lips despite everything. All right then, Lucas said. Option 2, we go on the offensive. We gather evidence of what happened, testimony from anyone who might have seen something, and we take it to the U.S. Marshal in Denver. The railroad might own the local law, but federal authority is harder to corrupt. It will be dangerous, and there are no guarantees it will work, but at least you would be fighting back. Sarah felt something kindle in her chest, a small flame of hope that she had thought the outlaws had extinguished. You would help me do that, even knowing what it might cost you. I already threw my lot in with you when I told Dutch to ride away, Lucas said. Might as well see it through. They spent the rest of the morning planning, with Lucas sketching out a rough map of the area and marking places where they might find witnesses or evidence. The railroad had been aggressive in its expansion throughout Weld County, and Lucas suspected that Sarah's father was not the only person who had been intimidated or worse. If they could find others willing to testify, they might have a case strong enough to bring federal attention. But first, Sarah needed time to heal and regain her strength, and they both needed to prepare for the possibility that Dutch would return with reinforcements. Lucas spent the afternoon checking his defenses, while Sarah, despite his protests, insisted on helping with what chores she could manage. She fed the chickens and gathered eggs, simple tasks that felt grounding after the chaos of the past few days. As she worked, she found herself watching Lucas, noticing the careful competence with which he approached every task. The way he spoke gently to his horses while checking their hooves and feed, the kindness in his hands when he splinted the wing of a hawk that had crashed into his barn during the storm. This was a man who valued life, who protected the weak, and Sarah felt her initial gratitude beginning to shift into something more complicated and intense. That evening, Lucas insisted she take his bed while he slept on the sofa, and they argued about it for 10 minutes before Sarah gave in, too exhausted to fight anymore. She lay in the darkness, wrapped in blankets that smelled like leather and sage, and listened to the sounds of Lucas moving around below, keeping watch, keeping her safe. For the first time since her father's death, Sarah allowed herself to cry, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed while running through the forest. These were tears of release, of grief finally given space to exist, and mixed with them was something unexpected: hope. Because of a cowboy who had looked at 10 armed men and decided that justice and decency mattered more than safety. Because someone had finally stood up and said no. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and comforting. Lucas continued his ranch work while Sarah recovered, her strength returning more each day as good food and rest did their work. They talked during meals, carefully at first, then with increasing ease, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Sarah learned that Lucas had grown up in Texas, the son of a horse trader who had died when Lucas was 16. He had worked cattle drives, served as a deputy in 3 different towns, and had seen enough violence to last a lifetime. He had come to Colorado looking for peace, for a place where he could build something lasting without constantly looking over his shoulder. Lucas learned that Sarah had been educated by her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before marrying James Atwood and moving west. Sarah could read Latin and Greek, knew her mathematics better than most men, and had dreams of attending college in the East, dreams her father had supported despite the raised eyebrows of their neighbors. She was 20 years old, full of opinions and fire, and Lucas found himself looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that surprised him. On the 4th day after Sarah's arrival, they were working together to repair a section of fence damaged by the storm when she suddenly stopped, her hammer suspended in mid-air. "What is it?" Lucas asked, instantly alert, his hand moving toward his gun. "Nothing dangerous," Sarah said quickly. "I just realized that I have not thought about dying in almost an hour. That is the longest I have gone since everything happened." Lucas lowered his hand, his expression softening. "That is good. It means you are healing at least a little." "I do not feel like I am healing," Sarah said quietly. "I feel guilty. Like I do not have the right to laugh or feel normal when my father is dead and his killers are free." Lucas set down his tools and moved to sit beside her on the fence rail. "Your father loved you, yes, more than anything. Then he would want you to live, not just survive. He would want you to find moments of peace, even happiness, despite what was taken from you. Carrying that grief forever, letting it consume you, that does not honor his memory. Fighting for justice honors his memory. Building a life honors his memory. Finding reasons to smile again honors his memory." Sarah looked at him, this unexpected man who seemed to understand her better than people she had known her entire life. "How did you get so wise?" "I lost my father too," Lucas said simply. Took me years to figure out what I just told you. Figured I could save you some time. Something shifted between them in that moment, a connection deepening beyond gratitude or shared purpose into something neither of them had been looking for but both recognized. Sarah reached out and took Lucas's hand, and he let her, his calloused palm warm against her cold fingers. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For saving me, for giving me time to heal, for helping me remember what it feels like to be human instead of just prey." Lucas squeezed her hand gently. "You were never prey, Sarah. You are a survivor, a fighter. Those men should be terrified of you." She laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "I think you might be slightly biased." "Maybe," Lucas admitted, and his smile made her heart do something complicated in her chest. They finished the fence as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and gold. Sarah stood watching the colors deepen and change, aware of Lucas beside her, and she felt something she had not expected to feel again for a long time. She felt content. That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Sarah found the courage to ask the question that had been building in her mind for days. "When this is over, when we have gone to Denver and given our testimony, what will you do?" Lucas was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "I will come back here, I suppose, try to rebuild whatever reputation I ruined by making enemies of the railroad. Hope they do not burn me out like they did your father." "And if they do," Sarah pressed, "if standing up for me costs you everything you have built?" "Then I will build again somewhere else," Lucas said simply. "I have done it before." "Does nothing frighten you?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Lucas turned to look at her, and the firelight reflected in his eyes. "Plenty frightens me. But I have learned that the things worth having are usually the things worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Otherwise, what is the point?" Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "What things are worth that?" Lucas held her gaze, and she could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth to speak. "Justice," he said finally. "Integrity. Protecting people who cannot protect themselves. And lately, I have been thinking that maybe companionship is worth fighting for too. Maybe having someone to share this life with, someone who understands what you value and why. Maybe that is worth any risk." Her heart was pounding now, loud enough that she was sure he must be able to hear it. "That sounds like more than companionship you are describing." "Maybe it is," Lucas said quietly. "Sarah, I know the timing is terrible, and I know you have been through trauma that would break most people. I am not trying to take advantage of that or of the situation that brought you here. But I would be lying if I said I had not developed feelings for you these past few days. Feelings that go beyond wanting to protect you or help you get justice. You are intelligent and brave and beautiful, and you make me laugh and think and hope for things I had given up on. So when this is over, when you are safe and free to make choices that are not influenced by fear or gratitude, I hope you might consider staying, or at least visiting, or at the very least, writing me letters so I know you are all right." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes, but these were good tears, sweet tears. "You want me to write you letters?" "I would prefer you stay," Lucas admitted, "but I will take what you are willing to give." She moved from her chair to kneel beside his, taking both his hands in hers. "Lucas Thorn, I have known you less than a week, which should not be long enough to feel what I am feeling. But you have shown me more kindness, more respect, more genuine care than most people show in a lifetime. You have made me feel safe when I thought I would never feel safe again. You have made me laugh when I thought I had forgotten how, and every time I look at you, I feel my heart do things that terrify and delight me in equal measure." "Sarah," Lucas started, but she shook her head. "Let me finish. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if we will succeed in Denver or if the railroad will destroy us both for trying. But I know that whatever happens, I want to face it with you. Not because I owe you or because I am grateful, though I am both those things. But because somewhere in the past few days, between feeding chickens and mending fences and talking by this fire, I started falling in love with you. And that terrifies me more than Dutch Morno ever could. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and careful, like she was something precious that might break. Sarah kissed him back, pouring into it all the emotion she had been holding inside, all the fear and hope and desperate, unexpected joy of finding something beautiful in the midst of tragedy. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. We are going to face some hard days ahead. I know. The railroad will not stop coming for you, for us now. I know. We might lose everything. I know, Sarah said again, and then she smiled. But we might win too. And either way, I would rather face it with you than face safety alone. Lucas pulled her into his arms, and they sat there by the fire, holding each other while the winter night pressed against the windows and the future waited, uncertain but no longer quite so frightening. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of weather that made the inside of your nose freeze with each breath. Lucas and Sarah prepared to ride to Greeley, the first step in their journey to Denver and justice. But before they could saddle the horses, they heard the sound of riders approaching, multiple horses moving fast. Lucas grabbed his rifle while Sarah moved away from the windows, her hand finding the revolver Lucas had given her the day before. They waited, tense and ready, as the riders came into view. But instead of Dutch and his men, they saw something unexpected. A dozen men and 3 women, neighbors and ranchers from across Weld County, armed and determined. The leader, a weathered rancher named Tom Blackwell, dismounted and approached the house with his hands visible and empty. Lucas stepped out onto the porch, rifle lowered but ready. "Lucas Thorn," Tom called. "That is me. We heard what you did, standing up to Dutch Morno and his thugs. Word travels fast, even in winter. We also heard you are harboring a witness to what they did to James Atwood." Tom's expression was grim but sympathetic. "We came to tell you that you are not alone in this. The railroad has been terrorizing this county for 2 years, burning out families, killing livestock, threatening anyone who will not sell. We have been too frightened to stand together, but after hearing what you did, what you risked for a girl you did not even know well, it shamed us. Made us realize that if we do not stand up now, we never will." Sarah appeared in the doorway beside Lucas, and Tom removed his hat respectfully. "Miss Atwood, I knew your father. He was a good man, an honest man. We should have stood with him when the railroad came calling. We are here to stand with you now if you will let us." Sarah felt her eyes burn with fresh tears, but she kept her voice steady. "Why now? What changed?" "Sometimes it takes one person being brave to remind the rest of us what bravery looks like," Tom said simply. "Your cowboy here did that. Now we aim to make it right." Over the next hour, more riders arrived until Lucas's small ranch looked like a gathering place for half the county. Each person had a story of railroad intimidation, of threats and violence, of neighbors who had disappeared or been bought off or been driven away. Together, they had enough testimony to bury Dutch Morno and his employers if they could get it to someone who would listen. They made plans to ride to Denver together, safety in numbers, to present their case to the U.S. Marshal. But first, they needed to secure evidence from Sarah's burned ranch, photographs if possible, anything physical that could corroborate their testimony. Lucas organized the group with the easy authority of someone who had led men before, assigning scouts and guards, planning their route to maximize safety while minimizing exposure. Sarah watched him work, saw the respect the other ranchers gave him, and felt pride swell in her chest. This was the man she loved, a natural leader who inspired others to be better than they thought they could be. They rode out at dawn the next day, a column of armed and determined settlers heading north toward the Atwood ranch. Sarah felt her anxiety build as they drew closer to the place where her father had died. But Lucas rode beside her the entire way, a solid and comforting presence that made facing her trauma possible. The ruins of the ranch were exactly as she had left them. The house burned to its foundation, the barn collapsed, scorch marks black against the snow. Sarah dismounted on shaking legs, and Lucas was there immediately, supporting her with gentle hands. "I can do this alone if you need me to," he said quietly. "No," Sarah said, straightening her spine. "I need to see it, need to remember what they took from me." They walked through the destruction together, and several of the other ranchers helped document the scene with a camera Tom had brought. They found evidence of accelerant use, proving the fire had been deliberately set, and they found bullet casings that matched the caliber Dutch's men carried. Most importantly, they found Sarah's father's journal in the remains of the root cellar where she had hidden, its leather cover charred but its contents readable. In it, James Atwood had documented every visit from railroad representatives, every threat, every escalating act of intimidation. "This is it," Tom said, handling the journal with reverence. "This is everything we need." As they prepared to leave, Sarah walked to where she thought her father's bedroom had been. Lucas followed at a respectful distance, giving her space but remaining close enough to help if she needed it. Sarah stood there for a long moment, remembering her father's laugh, his stories, his absolute conviction that right would prevail if good people refused to surrender. "I am sorry I could not save you," she whispered, "but I promise I will make sure your death meant something. I promise they will pay for what they did." She felt Lucas's hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. "He would be proud of you, of how strong you have been." "I could not have been strong without you," Sarah said, turning to look at him. "You gave me that strength when you decided I was worth protecting." They rode back to Lucas's ranch that evening, the entire group staying to plan their trip to Denver. Sarah helped cook a massive meal while the men and women shared stories and strategies. The mood was cautiously optimistic, the kind of hope that comes from finally taking action after too long spent in fear. That night, after everyone had settled into sleep in the barn and the main room, Lucas and Sarah stood on the porch, looking up at stars so bright and numerous they seemed impossible. "Whatever happens in Denver," Sarah said, "I want you to know that these past weeks have been the most important of my life. Not because of the danger or the fight, but because of you. Because you showed me what it means to have someone truly stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you, but right there beside you as an equal partner." Lucas took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I feel the same. You came into my life running from death, and somehow you brought life with you, purpose, meaning. I built this ranch hoping to find peace, but I never realized peace is not about being alone and safe. It is about finding someone worth fighting for, worth standing with no matter what comes." "When this is over," Sarah said carefully, "when Dutch is in prison and the railroad is held accountable, what then? For us, I mean." "I was hoping," Lucas said, his voice low and serious, "that you might consider staying here, not as a guest or someone I am protecting, but as my wife. As my partner in building something good and honest and lasting. I know it is fast, and I know you might want time to figure out your own path first, but I need you to know that my door is open. My heart is open. And if you choose to walk through, I promise to spend every day making sure you never regret it." Sarah turned to face him fully, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Lucas Thorn, are you proposing to me?" "I suppose I am," Lucas said, and despite the seriousness of the moment, she could see nervousness in his eyes. "Is that too presumptuous? Too fast?" "Yes to both," Sarah said, and watched his face fall before she continued. "But I do not care. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will stay here and build a life with you. Yes to everything, because life is too short and too uncertain to waste time pretending we do not know what we want. And I want you, Lucas. I want this life with you." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, no longer holding back the feelings they had both been dancing around. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Sarah was fairly certain her face was the color of summer roses. "We should probably wait until after Denver to get married," Lucas said practically, though his hands remained on her waist. "In case things go badly." "Agreed," Sarah said. "But after Denver, after we win, and we will win, Lucas, I want to marry you as soon as possible. I want to start our life together without any more delays or fears holding us back." They stood there for a long time, holding each other under the Colorado stars. Two people who had found something precious in the midst of tragedy and were determined not to let it go. The journey to Denver took 4 days through snow and cold, but their numbers kept them safe from any potential ambush. They saw no sign of Dutch or his men, though scouts reported seeing tracks that suggested someone was watching them from a distance. Lucas kept Sarah close, never letting her ride anywhere he could not see her, and she felt grateful for his protectiveness, even as she chafed at the limitations it imposed. Denver was a revelation after the sparse settlements and ranches of Weld County. Sarah had visited once as a child, but the city had grown substantially in the intervening years, with electric lights just beginning to appear on the main streets and buildings 3 and 4 stories tall lining the avenues. The marshal's office was in a solid brick building near the Capitol, and the marshal himself, a stern man named William Fletcher, agreed to see them immediately when he learned the size of their group and the nature of their complaint. They spent 6 hours in that office, each person telling their story, presenting their evidence, handing over James Atwood's journal and the photographs from the burned ranch. Marshal Fletcher listened to everything with the practiced attention of someone who had heard countless tales of injustice, but had not yet become jaded to them. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and studied the group before him. "You understand that what you are accusing the railroad of is extremely serious. They have significant political connections, substantial financial resources, and will fight this with everything they have." "We understand," Tom said, speaking for the group. "But we have right on our side, and we have each other. That has to count for something." "It does," Marshal Fletcher said. "And because of that, I am going to open a formal federal investigation into the railroad's land acquisition practices in Weld County. It will take time, and there will be trials, and some of you will need to testify repeatedly. But if what you have told me is true, and I believe it is, then people will go to prison for this. That I promise you." The relief in the room was palpable, people hugging and crying and shaking hands. Sarah felt Lucas's arm around her shoulders and leaned into his strength, hardly able to believe they had actually done it. Her father's death would have meaning. Justice would be served. But their celebration was cut short when a deputy burst into the room, his face flushed from running. "Marshal, we have a situation. Dutch Morneau and 8 men just rode into town. They are holed up in the Silver Star Saloon, and they are asking for Sarah Atwood." The room went silent, all eyes turning to Sarah. She felt fear try to claw its way up her throat, but then she felt Lucas's hand tighten on her shoulder, steadying her. "Why would they come here?" she asked. "They have to know we went to the law." Because they are desperate, Marshal Fletcher said, standing and reaching for his gun belt. They know if you testify, they hang. Their only play now is to eliminate you before the trial, hope that without your testimony we cannot prove murder, only the lesser charges of intimidation and arson. They are making their last stand. Then let us give them what they came for, Lucas said quietly, and every head turned to look at him. Not Sarah, obviously, but they want a confrontation. Let us give them one. You have 8 deputies, Marshal. We have 15 armed ranchers. We outnumber them 2 to 1, and we have the law on our side. We end this now, today, and we end it permanently. Sarah grabbed Lucas's arm. No, you could be killed. After everything, after surviving this long, I am not letting you walk into a gunfight. Lucas turned to her, his expression soft despite the danger. Sarah, love, this is what I am good at. What I have trained for my entire life, even when I was trying to run from it. And I am not doing it for glory or revenge. I am doing it so we can have the future we planned. So we can get married and build our life without looking over our shoulders, waiting for Dutch to return. This ends today, or it never ends. Marshal Fletcher nodded slowly. The cowboy is right. Morneau will keep coming until he is stopped permanently. Better it happens here, where we have the numbers and the legal authority, than in some ambush on the plains. But nobody goes in shooting. We try to take them alive for trial. Shooting is the last resort. The plan was simple but dangerous. Marshal Fletcher and his deputies would approach the saloon from the front, while Lucas and half the ranchers would circle around to cover the back exit. Tom and the remaining ranchers would secure the perimeter, making sure no innocent bystanders got caught in the crossfire and that none of Dutch's men escaped. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to demand that Lucas stay safe, but she saw the determination in his eyes and knew it would be pointless. This was who he was, a protector, a fighter for justice, and she loved him precisely because he was willing to stand up when others would walk away. "Promise me you will come back," she said, gripping his hands tightly. "I promise," Lucas said, and he kissed her with a fierceness that spoke of all the tomorrows they had not yet lived. "I am not giving up our future for anything, least of all Dutch Morneau. You wait here with Mrs. Hendricks. I will come back to you, and then we are going to get married and start our life. That is a promise." Sarah watched from the window of the marshal's office as the men fanned out across the street, their weapons ready but held low and careful. She could see the Silver Star Saloon, its painted sign swinging in the winter breeze, and she knew that behind those doors waited the man who had killed her father, who had chased her through the winter forest, who wanted her dead. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. She watched Marshal Fletcher and his deputies approach the saloon, saw the doors swing open, heard the faint call for Dutch and his men to surrender peacefully. There was shouting, heated words that carried across the street but remained indistinct. Then gunfire exploded, shattering the afternoon stillness. Sarah pressed her hand against the window, her heart in her throat, unable to see what was happening through the smoke and chaos. More shots, screams, the sound of breaking glass. It seemed to last forever and be over in seconds simultaneously. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Sarah stood frozen, searching the street for any sign of Lucas, terror building in her chest with each passing second. Then she saw movement, men emerging from around the buildings, and she spotted Lucas among them, walking steadily, apparently unhurt. Sarah bolted from the office, ignoring Mrs. Hendricks's call to wait, and ran across the street. She reached Lucas just as he was checking his weapon, and she threw herself into his arms with enough force to stagger him backward. "I am all right," he said, holding her tightly. "I am all right. It is over." Marshal Fletcher emerged from the saloon, grim-faced but satisfied. Dutch Morneau is dead, shot trying to escape out the back. 3 of his men are wounded but alive and in custody. The rest surrendered when they realized they were surrounded. It is done. Sarah felt her knees go weak, and Lucas supported her weight easily. It was truly over. Her father's killers would face justice, the railroad's crimes would be prosecuted, and she and Lucas could finally build the life they wanted without fear hanging over them. "Come on," Lucas said gently, guiding her back toward the marshal's office. "Let us get you somewhere warm. You are shaking." "That is because I thought I was going to watch you die," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was going to lose you before we even had a chance to begin." "You are not getting rid of me that easily," Lucas said with a small smile. "I promised you a future, and I intend to deliver." They stayed in Denver for 3 more days while Marshal Fletcher processed the arrests and began building his case. Tom and most of the other ranchers returned to Weld County, but a few stayed to provide security, unwilling to risk any remaining railroad sympathizers attempting revenge. On the 3rd day, Lucas and Sarah walked to a small church on the edge of town, a modest building with a kind minister who agreed to marry them with almost no notice. Sarah wore a simple dress purchased from a Denver shop, nothing fancy but clean and pretty, and Lucas wore his best shirt, newly washed and pressed. They exchanged vows in front of the minister, and 2 witnesses pulled from the street, promising to love and honor each other through all the challenges life might bring. When Lucas slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, purchased with money he had been saving for ranch improvements, she felt tears stream down her face, happy tears this time, joyful tears. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said with a warm smile. "You may kiss your bride." Lucas did, sweetly and thoroughly, and Sarah felt the last pieces of her shattered world click back into place, different than before but somehow stronger, forged in the fire of shared trauma and hardship into something that could withstand anything. They spent their wedding night in a Denver hotel, a luxury neither of them were accustomed to, but one they decided they deserved. Lucas was gentle and patient, and Sarah discovered that love could be tender and passionate simultaneously, that 2 people could communicate more with touch than with words. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms, Sarah traced patterns on his chest and felt perfectly content for the first time since her father's death. "I love you, Lucas Thorn." "I love you too, Sarah Thorn," Lucas said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "That sounds good, does not it?" "Sarah Thorn." "It sounds perfect," she agreed. They returned to Greeley the next week, riding together on Lucas's horse, and found their arrival greeted with something unexpected. The community had rallied in their absence, and when they crested the hill overlooking Lucas's ranch, Sarah saw that his small house had been expanded, a new room added to the side with the help of their neighbors. "A wedding gift," Tom explained, grinning at their shocked expressions. "We figured you would need more space, and we owed you both a debt we could never fully repay. Lucas, you gave us courage when we had none. Sarah, you gave us purpose. This is the least we could do." Sarah cried again, overwhelmed by the generosity and kindness of people she barely knew, humbled by the reminder that even in darkness, there was light. Lucas thanked everyone with his typical understated grace, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with quiet dignity. That night, in their expanded home, Sarah and Lucas began the process of building their life together. They talked about the ranch, about expanding the herd, about maybe raising horses like Lucas's father had done. They talked about children, how many they wanted, what they would name them. They talked about the future with the easy confidence of 2 people who had already survived the worst and knew they could face anything as long as they faced it together. The trial of the railroad officials and Dutch's surviving men took place the following spring, and Sarah testified with Lucas sitting in the front row, his steady presence giving her the courage to relive her father's death for the court. The defense tried to discredit her, to paint her as a hysterical woman prone to imagination, but the physical evidence and the testimony of 15 other ranchers corroborated every detail of her account. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The railroad executives received prison sentences, and Dutch's surviving men were convicted of murder, arson, and conspiracy. The railroad was forced to pay substantial compensation to the families they had displaced or harmed, and new federal regulations were passed to prevent similar abuses in the future. James Atwood's death had not been in vain. His courage and his daughter's determination to see justice done had changed lives across Weld County and beyond. 2 years after their wedding, Sarah gave birth to their first child, a strong, healthy boy they named James after her father. Lucas cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the joy of it. Sarah watched her husband cradle their baby with infinite gentleness and fell in love with him all over again. 18 months later, a daughter arrived, whom they named Elizabeth after Lucas's mother. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined spirit, and from the moment she could walk, she followed Lucas everywhere, determined to learn everything about ranching and horses and the wide open spaces of Colorado. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming known across the territory for its quality horses and the integrity of its owners. People sought out Lucas and Sarah for advice, for mediation of disputes, for the kind of wisdom that comes from having faced real hardship and emerged stronger. On winter evenings, when the snow fell soft and quiet across the land, Sarah and Lucas would sit by the fire with their children playing at their feet, and they would remember that terrible December when their paths had crossed. They would remember the fear and the violence, but more than that, they would remember the moment when a cowboy had looked at 10 armed men and decided that some things were worth fighting for. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked one such evening, years after that first meeting. Standing up to Dutch, you could have been killed, you could have lost everything. Lucas looked at his wife, at the children they had built together, at the life they had created from the ashes of tragedy. Not for a single second. Because saying no to Dutch meant saying yes to everything that mattered. It meant saying yes to you, to us, to this life. Some choices are easy when you understand what you are really choosing between. Sarah leaned into his embrace, watching the fire dance and listening to their children's laughter. "I am glad you chose me, chose us." "Always," Lucas said, kissing the top of her head. "In any life, in any circumstance, I would always choose you." Outside, the Colorado winter continued its ancient dance. Snow falling on mountains and plains, on ranches and towns, on people struggling and surviving and occasionally finding something beautiful in the midst of hardship. And in a small ranch house that had been expanded over the years to accommodate a growing family, 2 people who had found each other in the worst of times celebrated the best of times, grateful for every day, every moment, every shared breath. Their story became legend in Greeley and beyond, told around campfires and dinner tables, embellished with time but always true in its essential details. The cowboy who stood against 10 men for a stranger, the woman who survived and fought for justice. The love that bloomed in winter and lasted a lifetime. Years passed, and their children grew and had children of their own, carrying forward the values their parents had lived by. James became a lawyer, using the law to protect the vulnerable just as his grandfather and father had protected them with courage and conviction. Elizabeth took over the ranch, managing it with the same careful attention and integrity her parents had established. Sarah and Lucas grew old together, their hair turning silver, their hands weathered by work and time, but their love never diminishing. They had been forged together in fire and ice, in fear and hope, and that foundation proved unshakable through all the years that followed. On a spring day in their 73rd year, Lucas and Sarah sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where once 10 outlaws had threatened death and received defiance instead. Sarah's hand rested in Lucas's, their fingers intertwined with the comfortable familiarity of 50 years together. "You remember when I asked if you ever regretted standing up to Dutch?" Sarah asked, her voice still clear despite the years. "I remember everything about our life together," Lucas replied, his eyes warm as they looked at her. "Every moment has been a gift, even the hard times," Sarah teased gently. "Even when the drought killed half our herd, even when Elizabeth broke her arm falling from that horse." "Even then," Lucas said firmly, "because we faced those times together and we came through them together. That is what makes a life worth living, Sarah. Not the absence of hardship, but having someone to stand beside you when hardship comes. You have been that person for me for 50 years, and I cannot imagine having lived any other life." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, though she smiled through them. "You saved me, Lucas, in every way a person can be saved." "No," Lucas said, squeezing her hand gently. "We saved each other. That is what love does. It takes two people who are surviving and teaches them how to live." As the sun set over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah and Lucas sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. Their ranch, their family, their legacy of courage and integrity, all of it had begun on a winter day when a cowboy had looked at injustice and said no, when a woman had found the strength to keep fighting, when two strangers had recognized in each other the possibility of something extraordinary. The story that began with 10 men chasing a woman through winter snow had become a love story for the ages, proof that even in the darkest moments, hope and courage could light the way to something beautiful. And in that small corner of Colorado, where the mountains met the plains and winter gave way to spring each year without fail, their love endured as a testament to the truth that some promises, once made, are kept forever. They had built a life together from nothing but determination and love, and it had been more than enough. It had been everything.